Alden stood at the edge of the graveyard, the heavy scent of earth mixing with the autumn chill. His uncle's funeral had drawn a modest crowd, mostly business associates and distant relatives, none of whom Alden knew particularly well. He wasn't surprised. His relationship with the old man had always been distant, even strained. Alden had never been a part of his uncle's world. Not the world of adventure and wealth, not the world of legends. But now, as the last of the mourners filed out, he was about to be thrust headfirst into it. The lawyer approached, his expression stern but respectful. "Mr. Alden, if you would come with me, there are matters that need your attention." Alden followed him to the large, darkened vehicle parked near the gates of the cemetery. Inside, the lawyer handed him a leather-bound folder, thick with papers, and sat back as if expecting him to read through it right away. "Your uncle left you more than just the estate," the lawyer began, voice low and measured. "It seems he also left you a companion, his wife, Thera." Alden froze, his heart sinking. "Wife?" The lawyer nodded, unflinching. "Yes, Thera is not just a legal matter, Mr. Alden. She is bound to the inheritance, just as you are. She must remain with you until the terms are fulfilled." Alden opened the folder, skimming over the papers, his mind racing. His uncle had always been a mystery to him, a man who lived for adventure, secrets, and wealth. He had never once mentioned a wife, let alone someone named Thera. He glanced up at the lawyer, still unsure whether this was some sort of sick joke. "She's a woman," the lawyer continued, "but not entirely human. You'll see when you meet her." Alden's gaze narrowed. "Not entirely human?" The lawyer sighed, as though this conversation had become all too familiar. "She is a demi-human, Mr. Alden. Half beast, half human. Your uncle's marriage to her was unconventional but legal." He cleared his throat. "Her presence, her connection to the inheritance, is part of the contract. You need to accept her as part of your legacy." Alden felt a rush of confusion and unease, but before he could ask any more questions, the car came to a stop. The estate, grand and imposing, stretched before him. He could see a woman standing near the steps of the mansion. She was tall, with an aura of strength that contrasted sharply against the faded, old-world elegance of the home. Her eyes glimmered in the evening light, amber, wild, and striking. The moment they locked eyes, Alden's stomach tightened. The woman, Thera, was far more than he'd expected. Her long, dark hair framed a face that held an unsettling beauty. Her features were sharp, but there was something about her that screamed untamed, like a wolf that had wandered too far from its pack. Her body, though cloaked in an elegant dress, seemed to vibrate with a hidden power. She was more than just a demi-human, she was a mystery. As Alden stepped out of the car, the air between them thickened. There was an undeniable pull in the air, a magnetic force that made it hard for him to look away. Her gaze softened just slightly, and for a brief moment Alden thought he saw something in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe. Or was it caution? "Mr. Alden," she said, her voice low and melodic, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. "I see you've arrived." His throat went dry as he nodded, unsure of what to say. "Thera, I didn't know about you," he managed. The words felt clumsy, too blunt. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was something else, something wild and untamed, like the moon reflecting on the surface of a quiet lake. "No one did," she replied softly. "Not many know my kind exist, let alone that I'm bound to this place." Her words hung in the air, and Alden could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. This wasn't just about wealth or property. This was something deeper. Thera wasn't a mere servant or even just a companion. She was part of the legacy, a part of his uncle's world, now thrust upon him. "Shall we go inside?" Thera gestured toward the mansion. "There's much to discuss." The mansion's interior was just as grand as its exterior, expansive and dimly lit, with towering chandeliers and dark wood panels. It felt like stepping into a different time. Thera led the way, her steps graceful and purposeful, as if she owned the place. Alden followed, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and curiosity. Once inside, they sat in a large sitting room by a crackling fire. The lawyer, ever present, had already begun outlining the details of the inheritance. He explained the legalities, the responsibilities Alden now had, and the connection between him and Thera. But Alden wasn't listening. His attention was entirely on her. She sat across from him, her eyes never leaving his face. Her posture was relaxed, but there was an undercurrent of tension, as though she was waiting for something, or perhaps testing him. The way her eyes scanned him, evaluating, studying, was unsettling, and yet strangely captivating. "I didn't expect this," Alden admitted after a long silence, his voice thick with uncertainty. I thought I was just inheriting land and fortune." Thera tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And now you've inherited me." The words hung in the air between them, more charged than he expected. There was a certain finality in her tone, a suggestion of something far deeper than what he understood. Alden felt the room close in around him as a strange heat rose in his chest. It was uncomfortable, yet undeniable. "You don't have to accept me, Alden," Thera said quietly, almost as if reading his mind. "But I am bound to this estate, and to you until the terms are fulfilled." Alden blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Terms?" She nodded. "I cannot leave unless you allow it, but I can also stay if that is what you wish. There are many ways our connection can unfold." Alden's heart raced. Her words were laced with something deeper, something more than mere obligation. His pulse quickened, and for the first time since stepping into the mansion, he felt a stir of something, an unfamiliar sense of attraction. The fire crackled as the silence stretched between them. There was so much unsaid, so many questions left unanswered. "I'm not sure what you mean," Alden whispered. Thera's lips curved into a slight smile, her amber eyes never leaving his face. "You will, soon enough." Her words lingered, heavy with implication. The next few days passed in a blur of formalities. Alden met with the lawyer several times, going over the details of his inheritance, land deeds, wealth, and the numerous assets his uncle had left behind. The estate was far larger than he had imagined. Its sprawling gardens, rich library, and ancient stone walls carrying a sense of timelessness. But no matter how much he tried to focus on the practical matters, one thought lingered in the back of his mind. Thera. She was always there, just out of reach, waiting, watching him with those penetrating amber eyes. At first, Alden tried to keep his distance. He told himself it was for both their sakes, that they needed time to adjust. But each time they passed one another in the halls, the tension grew thicker, more palpable. Her presence, so effortlessly powerful, made him uneasy and, inexplicably, drawn to her. One afternoon, as he wandered through the grand library, Thera found him. She moved silently, like a shadow, her footsteps barely making a sound on the marble floors. She stood at the door, her gaze fixed on him, her long dark hair cascading down her back like a waterfall of night. Alden didn't hear her approach, but when he turned, there she was. "You spend a lot of time here, Alden," she said, her voice soft but tinged with curiosity. "The estate is vast, but I see you gravitate toward the past." Alden closed the book he had been idly flipping through and turned to face her. "I suppose it's the only part of this place that feels familiar," he replied, his words quieter than he intended. Thera stepped closer, the air between them thickening as she moved with a fluid grace that made it seem like the space around her bent to her will. She glanced at the book in his hand before her gaze returned to his face, unreadable. "The past can be comforting," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But it also keeps us bound, doesn't it?" Alden blinked, unsure what she meant by that. Her words, simple as they seemed, carried a weight that lingered long after she spoke them. "I don't understand," Alden said, his tone reluctant, but she was too close now. Her scent, earthy and wild, filled his senses. For the first time, he noticed how her presence wasn't just physical. It seemed to pulse with a force that made him uneasy. Her eyes, bright and watchful, flicked down to his hand where it rested on the book. "There's more to this place than just books and old memories," she murmured, the words soft but insistent. Her voice wrapped around him like a whisper in the dark. "More to us than you think." Alden swallowed, his pulse quickening as his mind tried to grasp what she was saying. He knew she wasn't just talking about the estate or even her unusual nature. There was something else in her words, something deeper, more intimate. "I don't want to be bound to this place," Alden said before he could stop himself, his voice more bitter than he meant it to be. He had inherited the estate, the wealth, and now it seemed her too. Everything felt too large, too overwhelming. He wasn't prepared for any of this. For a moment, Thara didn't respond. She merely stood there, watching him, her amber eyes reflecting a sadness that seemed at odds with her wild, untamed nature. Then slowly she stepped forward. "I never asked for this either," she said quietly, "but I am bound to it. To him. To you now." Alden's throat tightened, a strange ache forming in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about this situation he wasn't seeing, something that went beyond the legalities or the inheritance. "I didn't know about you," Alden said finally, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know about any of this." Thara's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "No one did," she said softly. "Not many are meant to. But now that you are here, Alden, you can't turn back." Alden's heart beat faster, the tension between them rising like a storm in the air. There was a moment of silence, the space between them charged with unspoken things. He couldn't help but feel the pull, the magnetic force between them, drawing him closer despite every instinct telling him to pull away. Then, unexpectedly, she took another step forward. Her proximity was almost overwhelming now, her presence enveloping him, leaving him breathless. Thara reached out slowly, her hand brushing against his arm as she placed her fingers lightly on the surface of the book. The contact was fleeting, but it ignited something in Alden. A spark, a sudden awareness of her warmth, her touch, and the powerful energy she exuded. He wasn't sure what to do, how to react. His mind screamed at him to step back, to maintain control, but something in the way she looked at him, like she saw right through him, made his resolve crumble. Her hand lingered for a moment longer before she withdrew it, but not without a subtle smile that hinted at something more. "You are already a part of this legacy," she said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "And I am a part of yours." Alden opened his mouth to speak, but before he could find the words, she turned and walked away, her figure melting into the shadows of the hallway. He stood there for a long time, the echo of her words and the memory of her touch lingering on his skin like a ghost. His heart was pounding, and he found himself at a loss, unable to comprehend the strange emotions swirling inside him. Was it fear, desire, or something more complicated? The next few days felt like an endless loop. Alden tried to ignore the growing tension, tried to focus on the practical side of things. But every time Thara was near, it was impossible to ignore the subtle currents between them. The way her gaze would linger on him, the way her presence seemed to fill the space around him with an undeniable pull. He found himself watching her more often than he intended, admiring the fluid grace with which she moved through the estate. She was like a force of nature, beautiful and wild, her presence impossible to ignore. That evening, Alden found himself in the main hall, standing by the massive window overlooking the garden. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the landscape. He hadn't noticed her approach until she was standing beside him, her presence like a shadow at his side. "We are both here, aren't we?" Thara's voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Alden's breath catch in his throat. Alden glanced at her, their eyes meeting for the briefest of moments before he quickly looked away. The pull between them was unmistakable, stronger now than ever. "Yes," he whispered, almost to himself. "We are." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with everything unspoken. Neither of them moved, as if waiting for the other to break the stillness. Alden spent the next few days trying to focus on the estate's management, but his mind kept drifting back to Thera. Every glance, every word she spoke seemed to pull him deeper into a world he wasn't prepared for, a world he didn't understand. It was as if she was always just out of reach, yet impossibly close, her presence a constant, unspoken tension between them. He found himself restless. The mansion, once just a grand but lifeless structure, now seemed full of shadows, of memories that belonged to someone else. Thera's shadow seemed to follow him everywhere, on the staircases, in the halls, even when he walked in the gardens. She was always there, her amber eyes ever watchful, her graceful movements impossible to ignore. One evening, after another tense dinner in the grand dining room, Alden retired to his study, needing space to breathe. The weight of the inheritance, the responsibility, and Thera's mysterious presence was starting to overwhelm him. He needed clarity, and yet, every time he closed his eyes, her face appeared in his mind, her touch lingering on his skin. The study was quiet, the flickering light from the fireplace casting shadows across the room. Alden poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands shaking slightly as the amber liquid swirled in the glass. He sank into the leather chair, staring at the flames, but his thoughts wandered. His uncle's legacy had always been one of secrecy, adventure, and wealth, but it was more than just money now. Thera was tied to this place, to the inheritance, to him. He couldn't escape that fact, no matter how hard he tried. As he swirled the drink in his hand, lost in thought, the sound of the door creaking open caught his attention. Alden didn't look up at first. He knew who it was before he even heard her voice. "You're brooding again," Thera said softly, her voice like the night wind, gentle but filled with an unspoken weight. Alden set the glass down with a soft thud, his mind suddenly racing. "I'm not brooding," he said, though the words lacked conviction. "Just thinking." Thera stepped into the room, the door closing silently behind her. She didn't sit, didn't move toward him. Instead, she stood there, watching him with those amber eyes, sharp yet full of something else, something he couldn't quite place. "You're not used to being in charge, are you?" she asked, her gaze never leaving him. There was an edge to her voice now, as if she were testing him. Alden exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I wasn't prepared for this. I didn't know about you, about everything." She nodded, as though his admission made perfect sense to her. "Most don't, but it's not about what you were prepared for. It's about what you do now." She moved closer, her steps slow and deliberate. There was a quiet tension in her movements, a silent invitation that Alden could feel deep in his chest. "I don't know what you want from me, Thera," Alden said, his voice rough, strained. "I inherited everything, this estate, the wealth, but you're not just a part of the inheritance. You're—" His words trailed off as he tried to understand what he was feeling. She was more than just a complication, more than a mysterious figure tied to his uncle's legacy. She was a force, something wild and untamed that pulled at something deep inside him. Thera was close now, standing at the edge of his desk. Her gaze softened just slightly, and she leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "I'm not asking for anything, Alden. Not yet." Her proximity made his pulse quicken. Her scent, rich and earthy, seemed to fill the air between them, her warmth radiating from just inches away. He could feel her presence like a tangible force, something powerful and yet fragile. He was almost afraid to speak, afraid to shatter the strange tension building between them. "Then why are you here?" She smiled, the expression soft and almost teasing. "I'm here because we're both bound to this place now, to each other. And whether you want to admit it or not, Alden, we're both a part of the legacy your uncle left behind. It's not just about money or property. It's about something far deeper." Alden's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel the heat between them, the unsaid words hanging heavy in the air. Thera had never been direct with him about what she wanted, but in this moment, the meaning was clear. There was a pull between them, something neither of them could ignore, no matter how much they tried. "I don't understand," Alden muttered, his voice low. "What do you want from me?" Thera reached out then, her hand lightly brushing the back of his, her touch like fire and ice at once. Alden stiffened, but didn't pull away. She slowly placed his hand on the desk, her fingers tracing the lines of his palm. "I don't want anything from you, Alden," she said softly, her breath warm against his skin. "Not yet, but we both know this is more than just business. You feel it too, don't you?" The question hung in the air, a challenge and a truth all at once. Alden swallowed hard, his hand tingling where hers had just been. He didn't know how to answer. The truth was, he did feel something. Something powerful. Something that made him question everything he had ever known about himself. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," Alden admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I can't stop thinking about you." Thara's gaze deepened, her eyes darkening with something unreadable. She took a step back then, her hand lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "You'll understand soon enough," she said softly. "But first, you need to let go of your fears, Alden. Only then will you see what's really here, what's really between us." Alden watched her retreat to the doorway, his heart racing as he tried to process everything she had said. Her words were like a puzzle, each one a clue he couldn't quite decipher. And yet, there was something undeniable about it all, the connection, the pull that neither of them could escape. "I'll leave you to your thoughts," Thara said, her voice soft. "But remember, Alden, we are both part of this legacy, and that means we are bound to it, to each other." The door closed behind her, leaving Alden alone with his thoughts. The room felt colder now, emptier without her presence. He stared at the empty doorway, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Confusion, desire, fear, and something else he couldn't name. He had inherited more than just an estate. He had inherited a complicated, dangerous legacy. And no matter how much he wanted to fight it, he knew there was no escaping it. Not now. Not with Thara in his life. Alden sank back into the chair, his mind racing, the weight of his uncle's legacy heavier than ever before. The next few days passed in a haze for Alden. The tension that had been building between him and Thara lingered, wrapping itself around him like a heavy cloak. Every glance, every word she spoke, seemed to carry an unspoken weight, a promise of something deeper, something more complicated than he was prepared for. He had spent his life avoiding complications, sticking to his quiet routine. And now he was stuck in a world he didn't understand, and the more he tried to resist, the more he found himself drawn into it. Despite his attempts to focus on the practical aspects of his inheritance, overseeing the estate, meeting with lawyers, and managing the assets, his thoughts continually returned to Thara. Her presence was undeniable, and no matter where he went, she was there, just out of reach. At times, he would catch her watching him from across the hall, her amber eyes following his every movement with an intensity that made his heart race. And whenever they spoke, there was always that same undercurrent of something more, something deeper. It was on the fifth evening after that conversation in his study that things finally came to a head. Alden had just finished dinner alone in the vast dining room. The grand table, with its polished surface and golden accents, seemed almost too large for him, a reminder of the solitude that accompanied his inheritance. He rose, intending to retreat to his study once again, to escape into the familiar comfort of his thoughts. But as he crossed the threshold of the dining room, he froze. Thara was standing there, waiting by the staircase, her back slightly arched in a way that made her presence all the more captivating. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her eyes, those amber eyes, locked onto his as soon as he stepped into the room. There was no mistaking the look she gave him. It was a quiet challenge, something that stirred a mixture of anticipation and hesitation in his chest. "You've been avoiding me," Thara said, her voice soft but laced with something else, something that made his pulse quicken. Alden swallowed, his throat dry. He hadn't realized how much he had been avoiding her until now, but it was true. Every time she was near, he felt an almost magnetic pull, one he couldn't explain or control. He wasn't sure what to say, what to do. He had always been good at keeping his emotions at bay, but with her it was impossible. "I've been busy," he said, his voice sounding too defensive even to his own ears. Thara tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, with a graceful step, she moved toward him, closing the distance between them in a way that felt deliberate. I understand, she said quietly, but that doesn't change what's between us. Alden's heart thudded in his chest. He could feel the heat of her body as she came closer, the air between them thick with something unspoken. He wanted to step back, to regain control of the situation, but his feet were rooted to the floor. There was something about her, a power, a presence, that made it impossible to pull away. You don't understand, Alden said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was frustrated, confused, torn between the desire to run and the need to stay. This wasn't part of the plan. None of this was. I don't know what you want from me. Thara's lips curved into a faint smile, though it wasn't one of amusement. It was something deeper, something that made Alden's breath hitch. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing against his arm. The touch was subtle, but it sent a jolt through him, a spark of awareness that made him acutely aware of her presence. I told you before, she said softly, her voice almost hypnotic. I don't want anything from you. Not yet. Alden's mind raced. He had never been one to give in to temptation so easily, never been one to let himself fall into something he couldn't control. But with her, it was different. There was a pull, something undeniable that made him want to give in, to let go of his defenses. His hand twitched at his side, and before he could stop himself, he reached out, his fingers grazing hers. The moment his skin touched hers, a wave of warmth flooded through him, washing away the doubts and fears that had been lingering in the back of his mind. Thara's eyes darkened as she looked at him, her gaze intense and filled with something deeper than desire. She didn't pull away, didn't hesitate. Instead, she stepped closer, her body now pressed against his, her breath warm on his neck. Alden's heart pounded in his chest, and he struggled to regain his composure. But her presence was overwhelming, her touch too intoxicating to ignore. He had no idea how to handle the situation, no idea how to navigate the strange, uncharted territory they were in. But one thing was certain. He could no longer deny the attraction, the pull between them. I don't know what's happening between us, Alden admitted, his voice low, his words heavy with the weight of his confession. Thara's hand slid up his arm, her touch light but deliberate. She leaned in closer, her lips just inches from his ear. You don't have to understand it, Alden, she whispered. You just have to feel it. And just like that, the tension between them snapped. Alden's mind was a blur as he finally allowed himself to lean into the sensation, to feel the heat of her body against his. His breath quickened, and for a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, to let go of the barriers he had spent years building around himself. But just as the moment seemed to reach its peak, Thara pulled away, her fingers trailing across his chest before she stepped back, leaving him breathless and confused. Not yet, Alden, she said again, her voice soft but firm. But soon, Alden opened his eyes, his chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. He didn't know what to think. Part of him wanted to push her away, to demand answers. But another part of him, something deeper, something primal, wanted to follow her, to let the mystery unfold. Thara gave him one last lingering look, her expression unreadable, before she turned and walked away, her steps silent and sure. Alden stood there, his mind racing, his body still thrumming with the aftershock of their closeness. He couldn't explain what had just happened, couldn't make sense of the emotions swirling inside him. But one thing was clear, he was in over his head. For the first time since inheriting his uncle's estate, Alden felt completely out of control. The legacy he had been thrust into wasn't just about wealth and property. It was about something deeper, something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As he stood there, alone in the hall, he realized that no matter how much he tried to resist, he was already caught in the web Thara had woven around him, and there was no way out. Not now. The next morning, Alden woke with the weight of the previous evening still pressing on him. He had spent the night restless, tossing and turning, his mind replaying every moment with Thera. The connection between them was undeniable, and he couldn't stop thinking about her. He had no idea what would come next, but he knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. Alden spent the next few days in a haze. He couldn't focus on anything: work, the estate, his responsibilities. His mind was consumed by Thera. The pull between them, the unspoken connection, kept drawing him back to her, even though he wasn't sure what to do with it. Each time they spoke, each time their paths crossed, the tension built. He could feel it in the way her eyes followed him, in the delicate way her touch lingered just a moment too long, in the soft whispers that carried more than simple words. It was on the third day after their last interaction when Alden found himself walking through the gardens, unable to shake the overwhelming thoughts of her. He had always found solace in the sprawling grounds of the estate, its ancient trees, its tranquil ponds, the blooming flowers that seemed to whisper secrets. But today, the beauty of the gardens was muted, overshadowed by the storm brewing in his chest. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening between them. As he walked through the path, his eyes scanned the landscape, but his thoughts remained entirely on Thera. The way her lips had brushed his ear, her soft voice that echoed in his mind, the way her body had pressed against his. It was impossible to ignore. Lost in thought again, Thera's voice suddenly broke through his haze, and he turned to see her standing at the edge of the garden, just beyond a thick hedge. She was leaning against the trunk of an ancient oak tree, watching him with those knowing eyes, as though she had been waiting for him to catch up to her. Alden's heart skipped a beat. How long had she been standing there? How much had she seen? He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "I didn't see you there," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though his pulse was racing. "I was just thinking." Thera smiled faintly, her gaze never leaving his. She pushed herself off the tree and stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the stone pathway. "I know," she said softly. "I can always tell when you're lost. You wear it on your face, Alden." He frowned, unsure whether he should feel embarrassed or something else. Something more complicated. "I don't know what you want from me, Thera," he said, his voice strained with frustration. "You're here and I'm here, but it's like we're both in different worlds. This is all too much for me." Her eyes softened at his words, but there was something in the way she moved, a quiet confidence that made Alden's heart race. She took a step closer, her presence filling the space between them. "I've told you before, Alden. I don't want anything from you. Not yet." Her voice was gentle, but there was an underlying challenge in it, as if daring him to understand. He felt the familiar tug at his chest, a part of him wanting to pull away from the intensity, from the emotions that swirled whenever she was near. But another part, a part he couldn't deny, wanted to lean into it, to let go of the control he had always maintained. "I don't understand," he admitted, his words heavy with vulnerability. "What are we doing? Why am I so drawn to you? This isn't what I expected when I inherited this estate." Thera's gaze deepened, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to hum with something more than just tension. "You think this is only about the estate?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You think this is just about money and power?" Alden didn't answer, but the question lingered in his mind. Was it? It had to be, but there was something else, something he couldn't put into words. The way his heart raced whenever she was close, the way her touch made him feel alive, like nothing else mattered. Thera took another step forward, her body close enough now that Alden could feel the warmth radiating from her. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. The touch was soft, but it sent a shock of warmth through him, making his breath catch in his throat. "No, Alden," she said softly, her voice almost too quiet to hear. "This is about something much more complicated, and you're a part of it now, whether you like it or not." Alden's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to pull back, to ask her what she meant, but the words didn't come. His mind raced, but his body seemed to betray him, leaning slightly into her touch, drawn in by the magnetic pull between them. Her eyes flickered down to his lips for just a moment before meeting his gaze again, and Alden felt his heart skip. You don't have to have all the answers right now, she said, her voice low, almost teasing. You just have to let go of the fear. You've been holding on to it for so long, Alden, and it's keeping you from seeing what's right in front of you. Alden swallowed hard. And what's that? Thara's lips curled into a smile, her expression unreadable. She stepped back, just enough to give him space, but the air between them still crackled with tension. You'll see soon enough, she said cryptically. Alden watched as she turned away, the soft sound of her footsteps barely audible as she walked deeper into the garden. She paused before disappearing around a corner, glancing back at him over her shoulder. You're not the only one struggling, you know, she said, her voice carrying on the breeze. But that doesn't change what's coming. Alden was left standing there, the words lingering in the air like an unspoken promise. Struggling? What did she mean by that? He didn't know what to think, what to do. He had always believed in control over his life, over his emotions. But with Thara, nothing was clear. She was a mystery, a beautiful, dangerous mystery that he couldn't untangle. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Alden went through the motions, meeting with the estate managers, reviewing documents, handling his new responsibilities, but his mind was never fully present. It was as if he were living in two worlds at once, one where he was the responsible heir to his uncle's legacy, and one where he was being slowly drawn into something far deeper and more complicated. As night fell and he sat alone in the study, staring at the fire that crackled in the hearth, Alden couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The unease, the tension, had been building for days, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He stood up, pacing the length of the room, unsure of what he was searching for. There were no answers here, no clarity, only more questions. The legacy his uncle had left behind, the mysterious connection with Thara, the pull between them, it was all too much. He needed a moment of peace, a moment to clear his head. As he moved toward the door, he hesitated. What if Thara was still out there, waiting for him? What if she wanted to speak to him again? The thought of being near her, of giving in to the strange pull he felt, sent a jolt of excitement through him, followed quickly by apprehension. But before he could make up his mind, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside his study. Alden froze. Thara's voice, low and unmistakable, reached him through the door. "Are you coming, Alden?" she asked, as if she had known all along what he was thinking. His breath caught in his throat. There was no going back now. He couldn't avoid her any longer. With a deep breath, Alden opened the door. Alden stepped into the hallway, the cool air of the evening brushing against his skin as he walked toward Thara's voice. The dim light from the candles lining the walls cast long shadows, making everything feel as though it were suspended in time, waiting for something to shift. As his footsteps echoed on the stone floor, his heart pounded in his chest, each beat growing louder, faster. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he couldn't stop himself. When he reached the end of the hall, Thara was standing there, waiting. The soft light from the sconces above illuminated her features, making her seem almost ethereal. She was leaning against the wall casually, but there was something about her presence that demanded attention, something magnetic that made it impossible to ignore her. Her amber eyes locked onto his as soon as he appeared, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, the air between them thick with anticipation. Alden swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "What is it, Thara?" he asked, his voice strained but quiet. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe an answer to the questions that had been plaguing him, maybe an explanation for the strange bond that had been forming between them. But when she looked at him, there was no clarity. There were only those eyes, burning with something he couldn't name. Thara smiled faintly, a small, almost secretive curve of her lips. She pushed herself off the wall and took a slow step toward him, her bare feet making no sound as they moved. Alden's breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively took a step back, though he didn't want to. He was drawn to her, but the uncertainty of it all made him hesitate. "You've been distant," Thara said, her voice soft but carrying an edge. I thought we were past that, Alden. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure of how to respond. He couldn't exactly argue with her. He had been distant, both physically and emotionally. Every time she came near, he had felt a flood of emotions he wasn't prepared for. But now, standing here, alone with her in the dimly lit hall, everything felt more real than ever. The tension between them was palpable, almost unbearable. I've been trying to figure things out, Alden said, his voice quieter now. I don't understand any of this. He gestured vaguely between them, as though trying to encompass the tangled mess of feelings and circumstances that had been pulling him in different directions. Thara's eyes softened, her expression shifting to something more understanding, but there was still that enigmatic glimmer in her gaze. She took another step closer to him, and Alden's breath caught. The warmth of her body, the intoxicating scent of her skin, seemed to fill the space between them, making the world outside of this moment feel distant, irrelevant. You don't have to understand it, Alden, she said, her voice now a gentle murmur. You just have to let it happen, to stop fighting it. Her eyes searched his face as if looking for some kind of answer, and Alden felt his pulse quicken in response. I don't know if I can, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He wanted to resist, wanted to find a way to put things back in the neat, orderly life he had once known. But the more he tried to distance himself, the more the pull toward her became undeniable. Thara was so close now, her presence overwhelming. Alden could feel the heat from her body, could hear the soft rise and fall of her breath. She reached out slowly, her hand hovering just above his arm, as though giving him a chance to pull away if he wanted to. But Alden didn't move. He stood there, frozen, heart racing in his chest, and let her touch him. Her fingers brushed lightly against his skin, and it was as though a jolt of electricity ran through him. You're scared, she whispered. And I understand. I am too. Her gaze softened, her expression almost vulnerable. Alden wanted to say something, to ask her what she meant, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time in days, his mind went quiet. All that existed was the feel of her hand on his arm, the soft warmth of her body, and the beating of his heart in his ears. The distance between them was closing, but still there was a gap, a chasm between the unknown and the inevitable. I don't know if I can handle this, Alden confessed, his voice raw with the truth of it. It's too much. This estate, everything. It's all just too much. Thara's fingers tightened around his arm slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough to send a surge of warmth through him. She stepped closer, her lips hovering near his ear, and Alden could feel the heat of her breath as she spoke. You don't have to handle it alone, she said softly, her voice full of an unspoken promise. Let me help you. Alden's heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment, all he could do was stand there, caught in the pull of her voice, her presence. He could feel the quiet intensity between them, the unspoken bond that seemed to tie them together in ways he didn't fully understand. He wanted to pull away, wanted to step back and regain control, but something deeper, something far more primal, kept him in place. Thara's fingers slid from his arm to the collar of his shirt, her touch light but deliberate. The sensation sent a shiver down Alden's spine, and he inhaled sharply. She was so close now, and the air between them felt thick, charged with something they could both feel but didn't quite understand. I don't want to fight this anymore, Thara murmured, her voice low and filled with something Alden couldn't place. I don't want to hold back. Alden's breath caught in his throat. The words, the way she said them, they left him reeling, unsure of how to respond, unsure of what he wanted anymore. His mind was spinning, torn between desire and fear, between the pull of Thara and the weight of his inherited responsibilities. I don't know what to do, Alden admitted, his voice strained. I don't know what I want. Thara's lips curved into a faint smile, and she leaned in just enough that Alden could feel the warmth of her body against his. Her eyes searched his face, as though she was looking for something, some sign that he was ready. You don't have to know, she whispered. Not yet. You just have to trust me. Her hand slid up his chest, her fingers brushing against his collarbone as she leaned in closer still. Alden's heart pounded, and for the briefest moment, he thought she was going to kiss him. Her lips so close to his, her breath mingling with his, but just as quickly, she pulled back. The tension remained, thick and heavy between them, but she didn't move away. Instead, she looked up at him, her gaze intense, her lips slightly parted. "We're not there yet," she said softly, "but we will be." Alden stood there, frozen in place, unable to speak. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, with the promise of what could come. But he couldn't take the next step, at least not yet. Something was holding him back. Some fear, some hesitation that he couldn't name. "I'll be here," Thra said, her voice low and steady. "When you're ready." Alden didn't know what the future held, but as he stood there, staring into her eyes, he knew one thing for certain. Things would never be the same again. Alden had never been one to shy away from difficult situations, but standing in the dimly lit room, with the weight of Thra's gaze upon him, he felt unprepared, vulnerable in a way that he hadn't anticipated. The distance between them had been closing slowly, but now it felt like the gap was smaller than ever. Every glance they exchanged, every quiet word, seemed to add more weight to the already complicated connection between them. He turned away from her, trying to steady his breathing, trying to regain some semblance of control. The overwhelming pull of his own emotions, the confusion, and the desires he tried to ignore for so long were now impossible to push aside. And Thra, she seemed so sure, so confident in what she wanted, in what she needed. The tension between them was undeniable. "I don't know what to do," Alden whispered, his voice strained. "It feels like everything is changing, and I don't know how to stop it." Thra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step forward, the soft sound of her footsteps the only noise in the room. The silence hung heavy between them, and Alden could feel the subtle shift in the air as she drew closer. She wasn't in a hurry, but there was something in her presence that demanded his attention, that made him feel like he couldn't look away. "You don't have to stop it," Thra finally said, her voice soft but firm, as though she had made up her mind long ago. "You just have to accept it." Alden's eyes flickered to her, but he didn't meet her gaze directly. His heart thudded in his chest, and his mind raced, torn between wanting to pull away and wanting to stay. The war inside him was growing more intense with every passing second. "Accept it?" he repeated, his voice rough. "How can I just accept it when everything is so complicated?" Thra's eyes softened, and she reached out, her hand lightly grazing his arm. It was a gentle touch, but it sent a jolt of warmth through him, and he found himself frozen in place, caught between wanting to resist and wanting to surrender. "Complicated is just another word for something worth fighting for," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've always been the one to take on difficult challenges, Alden. But this one is different. You don't need to fight it." Her fingers traced a slow, deliberate path across his arm, and Alden felt his breath catch in his throat. There was something about the way she touched him, something tender and intimate, yet undeniably powerful. It was as if her touch was unraveling all the walls he had built around himself. "I'm not like you," Alden admitted, his voice strained with the raw honesty of it. "I don't have the same strength, the same instinct. This world you live in, it's so different from mine." Thra paused, studying him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she closed the distance between them, her body warm and close as she stood before him. Alden felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't move away. He was afraid of what might happen if he did. "Maybe you don't have the same strength," she murmured, "but you have something else. You have the ability to learn, to adapt, to understand what's at stake." Alden could feel the heat of her breath on his face now, the faint scent of her skin and the softness of her voice sending his senses into overdrive. He wanted to say something, to ask her what she meant, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The only thing he could focus on was the feeling of her standing so close to him, her presence filling the space between them, demanding his attention. You don't have to understand everything right now, she continued, her voice a whisper as she reached up to gently trace the line of his jaw with her fingers. You just have to trust that some things are worth exploring. Her touch was so light, so delicate, but it left a trail of warmth in its wake. Alden's heart raced as he stood there, unable to pull away. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to or not. It was as if Tharaz's touch was both a question and an answer, a silent invitation that he wasn't sure how to accept. What if I'm not ready? Alden asked, his voice barely audible as his chest tightened with the uncertainty of it all. Tharaz's eyes softened as she leaned in closer, her lips just a breath away from his. The moment felt suspended in time, the world outside of this room fading into the background. She didn't rush him, didn't push him. She simply stood there, waiting, offering herself to him in a way that was gentle but unyielding. You'll know when you're ready, she whispered, her lips brushing his in a fleeting, soft kiss. The contact was brief, but it sent a spark of warmth through him, a quiet promise that things were changing, whether he was ready or not. Alden stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The kiss had been gentle, innocent even, but it had left an undeniable mark on him. There was no going back from this, no pretending that everything was the same as it had been before. Thara had crossed the line, and though he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next, he knew it would be impossible to walk away from it now. His fingers twitched at his sides, and before he could stop himself, he reached up to touch her face, his fingertips grazing the soft curve of her cheek. She didn't pull away, instead leaning into his touch as though encouraging him to explore, to learn. I don't know what this means, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I know I can't walk away. Thara's smile was small but knowing, as if she had already anticipated his words. Good, she said softly, because neither can I. She closed the space between them once more, but this time, there was no hesitation in Alden's movements. His hand moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and the sensation of her body against his sent a rush of warmth through him. His heart pounded, and he felt a strange sense of peace, as though this moment, this connection, was exactly where he was supposed to be. But even as the heat between them grew, a part of Alden's mind couldn't help but wonder what the future would bring. What did it mean to truly accept this, to accept Thara and the world she came from? And what would it cost him to give in to the pull that was drawing them together? For now, though, all he could do was hold her, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his own, and hope that somehow they could both figure it out together. Alden woke to the sound of soft footsteps outside his door, followed by the faint rustling of fabric. His heart skipped in his chest as he slowly opened his eyes, the warmth of the morning sun spilling through the window and casting a golden glow over the room. He lay still for a moment, his mind racing to catch up with the events of the past few days. The memory of Thara's presence lingered in his thoughts, like a dream that he couldn't shake. Her touch, her words, and the unspoken promise between them had shifted something deep inside him. It was as if the world outside had become distant, and the only thing that mattered now was the space they shared together. The knock at the door broke his reverie, and Alden sat up, pushing aside the blanket. He reached for his clothes, still half dazed from sleep, and made his way to the door. Come in, he called, his voice still rough from the remnants of slumber. The door creaked open, and Thara entered, her presence filling the room in an instant. She wore a loose robe, the fabric flowing gracefully around her, and her eyes were filled with a quiet intensity that made Alden's heart race once more. Good morning, she said softly, her voice like a melody that seemed to settle over him, comforting and unfamiliar all at once. Alden nodded, trying to hide the flutter of nerves in his chest. Good morning. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, eyeing each other in a way that felt both new and strangely familiar. It wasn't just the physical distance between them that had changed. Something deeper had shifted, and Alden wasn't sure how to navigate it. I was hoping we could talk, Thara said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying urgency in it that Alden couldn't ignore. He nodded, gesturing to the chair by the window. Of course, please sit. She hesitated for only a moment before crossing the room to take the seat he had offered. Alden followed, sitting across from her. The air between them seemed thick with unsaid words, and he couldn't help but notice the way Tharaz's eyes kept flicking to him, as though she was weighing something in her mind. "You've been distant," she said, her gaze steady but searching. "I can feel it." Alden's heart tightened at her words, but he didn't look away. I'm still trying to make sense of everything. This isn't exactly what I expected when I inherited, well, everything." He gestured vaguely to the room around them, the home that had once belonged to his late friend. Tharaz's expression softened, and she reached out, placing her hand gently over his. "I understand that this is a lot. I didn't expect this either. But what's important now is us. I need you to see that. What we have." She paused, as though searching for the right words. "It's something I can't ignore, and I don't think you can either." Alden looked down at their hands, the warmth of her touch sending a shiver down his spine. Her skin was soft, but the strength in her fingers was undeniable, a subtle reminder of the power she held beneath the surface. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Alden confessed, his voice low. "I don't know how to be the man you need." "You're already the man I need," Thara replied, her voice firm but gentle. "You're more capable than you give yourself credit for, Alden. You've faced challenges before, and you'll face this one too." There was a quiet intensity in her words, as though she truly believed in him. It made something stir deep inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite place. But in that moment, he realized just how much he wanted to believe her, to believe in what they could be together. "I want to be that man," he admitted, meeting her gaze at last. "But I'm afraid of what it means, afraid of what we'll become." Thara's eyes softened, and she leaned forward, her lips brushing against his hand in a brief but tender gesture. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Alden. I would never ask you to be something you're not. But what we have is real, and you have to decide if you're willing to take that step with me." Alden swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Her words, her touch, everything about this moment felt like a doorway to something new, something uncertain, but undeniably powerful. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he didn't know how to walk away from it either. The pull between them was too strong. "What happens if I don't take that step?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Thara's gaze softened, her hand still resting on his. "Then we stay where we are. But I can't promise that won't hurt both of us in the end." Alden's mind raced, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words to express what he was feeling. But then he realized that perhaps he didn't need words. Perhaps it was enough to just be here, with her, facing the unknown together. "Maybe I'm not ready," Alden said, his voice shaky, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see where this goes." Thara smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made his heart ache with something he couldn't quite identify. "That's all I need, Alden. Just a willingness to try." She leaned forward again, her lips brushing his in a kiss that was soft but deep, filled with the promise of what was yet to come. It was a kiss that spoke of trust, of the unknown, and of the fragile thread that connected them both. When they broke apart, Alden found himself breathless, his heart pounding in his chest. There was so much left unsaid, so much left to explore between them, but for the first time since all of this had started, he felt like he might be able to face it. They might be able to face it together. "I don't know what the future holds," Alden murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "But I want to find out with you." Thara didn't respond with words, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. They were in this together, for better or for worse, and somehow that was enough. But as the minutes passed, and the weight of their quiet exchange lingered in the air, Alden couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenges were just beginning. There were still so many questions, so many uncertainties. What would their future look like? What sacrifices would they both have to make? And what if, in the end, they weren't enough to bridge the divide between their worlds? Alden didn't have the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might be able to find them. Together, the days that followed were a blur, but the air between Alden and Thara had changed, shifting into something deeper, more profound. As the weeks passed, They grew more attuned to each other, navigating the complexities of their bond with an understanding that neither of them had anticipated when this all began. Every moment they shared was a quiet exploration of trust, of what it meant to be with someone from another world, in both a literal and metaphorical sense. Alden still found himself wrestling with the weight of his responsibilities. The fortune he had inherited, the legacy of his late friend, was far more than just riches. It was a life that had been built with power, with decisions that would affect more than just him. And Thera, as much as she had come to mean to him, was not only a part of this world but a reflection of it. She was a creature of a different kind, one whose needs and desires Alden had only begun to understand. But as each day passed, those fears began to fade, replaced by a growing certainty. Thera was not a complication, but a partner. Together, they could face whatever challenges arose. Together, they could change the world around them, or at least their place in it. One evening, after a long day of negotiations with the various representatives of the lands Alden had inherited, he found himself in the study, lost in paperwork, when Thera appeared at the door. The light from the setting sun bathed her in a soft, golden glow, and for a moment, Alden couldn't help but stop and stare at her. Her presence still had that effect on him. It was as though the world around them ceased to exist whenever she entered a room. She was as much a part of this world as he was, yet so much more. She had her own strength, her own grace, her own world inside of her that Alden was still learning to understand. "Taking a break?" she asked, her voice light, teasing even. Alden chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "I could use one. This paperwork is never ending." Thera stepped into the room, crossing the floor with the same fluidity and grace that Alden had come to expect from her. There was something in the way she moved, something predatory yet comforting. She was a creature of the wild, of the forest, of the untamed. But in this space, with him, she was also something else. A companion, a confidant, a partner in everything. "I thought you might need some company," she said, her smile soft. But the warmth in her eyes was unmistakable. Alden stood and walked over to her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "I'm glad you came. I don't think I could get through this without you." Thera's eyes sparkled, her expression playful but also sincere. "I think you'd manage just fine. You've always been strong, Alden." Her words echoed in his mind. He hadn't always felt strong, not in the way she meant. But with her by his side, he was beginning to understand what strength truly was. Not just the power to conquer, but the power to accept, to be vulnerable, to trust in another. "I've learned a lot from you," Alden said quietly, his thumb brushing over the fabric of her sleeve. "You've shown me that there's more to life than I ever realized." Thera's smile softened, and she stepped closer, the distance between them growing smaller. "And you've taught me to trust again, Alden, to believe that there's more out there than what I've known." He reached up, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering there for just a moment too long. Her eyes locked with his, and for a second, the world seemed to fall away. It was just the two of them in that quiet room, their connection undeniable, their bond more than just a fleeting thing. It was something that would last, something that could withstand the trials they would face. "You were right," Alden whispered. "I'm ready to take this step with you, ready to see where this path leads." Thera's lips curled into a soft smile, and she leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. It was a simple gesture, but it held a depth of meaning that words could not capture. "I'm glad," she whispered against his skin. "I knew you would be." Alden closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to savor the warmth of her touch, the tenderness in the air. He had been afraid of this, of letting someone in, of letting someone so different from him into his life. But now, with her, he realized that he hadn't been afraid of her at all. He had been afraid of himself, of what it meant to let go of the control he had always held so tightly, to trust in something more than logic and reason. He took a deep breath, pulling back slightly to meet her gaze. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together, right?" Thera's eyes softened, and she nodded. Together. There was no more doubt in his heart, no more questions. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew that he was no longer alone. He had Thra by his side, and that made all the difference. The weight of the world seemed lighter now, not because it had become easier, but because he didn't have to carry it by himself anymore. With Thra, he was not just the man who had inherited a fortune. He was a man who had found something real, something worth fighting for. As they stood there, in the fading light of the evening, Alden felt a sense of peace settle over him. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to meet it head on. He didn't need to know all the answers. All he needed was to take the next step, one foot in front of the other, with Thra by his side. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a soft, ethereal glow, Alden knew that no matter what challenges awaited them, they would face them together. The world had changed, but in that moment, it felt like the beginning of something new, something that neither of them could have imagined but both were willing to embrace. Together,